Hello, in this class, we're going to learn what Google Looker Studio is, why it's important, and the application cases this tool has. Looker Studio is a tool developed by Google, previously known as Data Studio, and it's now the fusion between Looker and Data Studio, allowing us to have an even more powerful tool. Generally speaking, it's a platform that lets you create reports and data visualizations. In Looker Studio, we can build dashboards and interactive, real-time charts from various data sources. It's one of the most popular tools for business intelligence. The number of data sources we can integrate with Looker Studio makes it one of the most sought-after and widely used tools in business intelligence, not only in the digital realm, but also in other business application cases. Alongside Power BI, Tableau, and Click, it's one of the most used tools, which makes it an essential option in this field and offers a considerable learning opportunity. Why should we choose Looker Studio? Looker Studio offers a very complete free version. If we compare it with other competitive tools, we'll see that they require monthly fees to access all their features. However, Looker Studio's Pro features are only used in very advanced cases where additional integration is needed. With the free version, we can solve most use cases in our daily workflow, since it offers almost all functionalities without requiring a payment. One of its advantages is real-time report automation. Later, we'll see that this automation is much easier to implement compared to other tools. This also means that its learning curve is very quick. Basically, it's a drag-and-drop interface that we can easily implement for the use case we need to work on. It's the best tool for data visualization in the digital environment. If you work in the digital world, in digital marketing, social media, advertising, or use tools like Google Analytics, Google Search Console, or YouTube, Looker Studio is the go-to tool for this type of analysis, making it its strongest point. If we work with more Google tools, such as Analytics or YouTube, it will integrate easily via native connectors developed by Google. If you're not yet familiar with connectors, don't worry. We'll cover that shortly. What are the most common application cases for Looker Studio? Nowadays, social media is one of the most efficient means for advertising, and knowing how to build social media reports and automate them in real time is one of the most in-demand skills in the job market. Looker Studio stands out for this type of reporting. Another application case is in paid advertising reports when ads are run on different digital media, such as social media, the Google ecosystem, or external media. Here it's also a powerful and widely used tool. Looker Studio is the standard when working with information from social media and digital advertising. It's also used for reporting and data visualization within the Google environment, such as Analytics, Search Console, Google Ads, Google Sheets, Tag Manager, or YouTube. As a native application, it integrates very easily. So, if you're in digital marketing, advertising, or community management, Looker Studio will provide you an advantage in your work environment and enhance your capacity to generate social media and digital advertising reports. What's the magic of Looker Studio? Unlike other tools, Looker Studio allows for a model that goes from the data source, such as Facebook ads, Google Ads, or YouTube. This data source can be dragged into Looker Studio via a connector, whether it's a native Google connector or one developed by a third party, allowing different data sources to be connected with minimal configuration and directly brought into the tool. With this workflow methodology, Looker Studio facilitates automation. Our connector queries the data source and brings it into Looker Studio so we can develop our visualizations and reports. Imagine for a moment how reports are traditionally made. This trend is changing, and more business intelligence and visualization tools are being used. However, the classic method is to bring data into an Excel or Google Sheets spreadsheet and create the necessary charts from there. This approach has a drawback, as it requires more time to build and often doesn't allow for data automation. Spreadsheets need to be updated, and charts have to be built repeatedly. With Looker Studio, we solve this problem. I'll show you what a standard Looker Studio report looks like, where we have a large amount of real-time data. Here we can apply time filters, view aggregates, time series charts, category-based charts, and more. In the example we see on screen, it corresponds to a website where we've brought in all the data generated in real time. We didn't have to build spreadsheets or manually extract data. We simply built our reports, and they update automatically. Throughout this course, we'll learn how to generate a good report, understand the automation process, and see how to integrate it into your daily workflow. As we saw in the previous class, to make the most of Looker Studio's features, we need to have a data source. Don't worry, because Google also has a solution. Google has created a demo account for us to explore across several of its products. What prerequisites do you need to meet? You need to have a Google account. So make sure to sign in with your Gmail account. If you don't have a Gmail account yet, I recommend creating one, as we'll need it throughout the course. Why will we use the Google Analytics 4 demo account? The reason is simple. This account collects real-time information and allows us to take advantage of Looker Studio by automating the integration of all this data into a report. We'll use the available information in Google Analytics 4, which comes from a real Google website. They give us read-only access to the information generated on this site. To find this site, type in your browser, Google Merchandise Store. Click on the first search result. You'll see that it's a fully real online store. It's not just a sample account, but collects data from people who buy official Google products. If you explore the site, you'll find various items and product categories related to the Google brand. From here, we'll take all the information we need for the development of this course. Now that we know what data we'll be working with, I'll guide you through the process to start using it. In your browser, type Google Demo Account. Select the first option in the search results. Scroll down, and you'll see an article explaining what the Google Demo Account is. In broad terms, it describes the uses of the demo account, its data sources, and which Google products we can use it in. For this case, we'll use the first option, which corresponds to the Google Analytics 4 information from the website we reviewed. To activate this demo account, we just need to click. This will take us directly to Google Analytics and automatically set up our data source. If you're not familiar with Google Analytics, it's a tool that allows tracking the flow of users who interact with a website or mobile app and records the actions they take on them. I've left a guide in the class resources to help you better understand Google Analytics uses and the types of data it collects. I also recommend exploring this interface, as it contains real functioning information. See you in the next class, where we'll learn more about Looker Studio. All right, it's time to work on the types of charts directly in Looker Studio. Forget about the report we created earlier, where we were exploring the interface. Let's go back into Looker Studio and create a new report. Create Report. This will also help us review how to connect the data source. We will select the Google Analytics data source. We select the demo account and the merch shop. We add it to the report, and that's it. We have now connected our data source to start working. There's a good practice whenever you connect a new data source. Change the name. This is so you can identify your data source, as when you work on very large reports, you will realize that you will use information from multiple sources and will need to know which is which. Let's suppose you are working on a regional account that has separate accounts for Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. You will need to know how to identify that data source. So I'm going to teach you how to change the name of the data source. We go to Resource, Manage Added Data Sources, and here we will have our data source associated. For now, it's the only one we have. This is useful when we use multiple data sources. We go to the Edit section and change the name. I will name it Google Demo Account Looker Studio. Correct. That is the name I want to use to identify this data source. You can give it any name you want, but the idea is for you to understand how to make that name change. I also want you to notice something important here. How it shows us the data. Here we will have all the data, in this case, dimensions and metrics of what we will find within this data source. How to identify a dimension from a metric? Generally, dimensions, as we saw, are categorical variables that can be text, dates, countries, among others. On the other hand, metrics have numerical values. Here we can have added items, viewed items, conversions, ad impressions, click-through rates, among other metrics. Once we've changed the name, we click on Done, close it, and we're all set. By default, a table is always dragged in. However, we will delete it because we will work with other types of charts. We will also change the name of our report. I will name it Types of Charts. You can name it whatever you want. Now, let's start working. The first chart we will look at is the scorecards. Scorecards allow us to display total or aggregated results of our data. But before that, I want us to look at something. While it's true that later we will work on types of controls, I want us to check one in advance, which is the date range control. This control allows us to select a predetermined period to show the amount of that metric within the range we have defined. Here we can set a custom period we want to see. For example, I want to see the first 15 days of November, so I will select from November 1st to November 15th, click on Apply, and the data will update with the results obtained during those dates. Now, moving on to the topic of charts, the first one we will see is the scorecard. We will go to Add a Chart and select the first of the scorecards. When we select it, we can drag it anywhere in the report. At the beginning of the course, I mentioned that Looker Studio is a tool with a lot of drag and drop, which is why its learning curve is lower. Once I select the desired chart, it brings up a default metric. In this case, it brought the metric of views. But before anything else, I will change the period in which I want my data to be displayed. I will select last month, and it will show me the date from October 1st to October 31st. When I click on Apply, the data will be modified with this control. Now we begin to understand the importance of controls. For this class, we will work with the previous month. Now I want to add another metric. I will also select my scorecard, and I want this new scorecard to bring me the information for new users. How do I change the default metric it brings? There are two ways to do it. I can go directly to the chart settings in the metric section, search for the metric I want to change, and select it. In this case, we will look for new users. By doing this, we see that it has already changed to the newly selected metric. The other way to do it is to look for it directly in the section called Data. To do this, we go to the search bar and type New Users. To add it, I simply drag it directly to the metric section within the chart settings. However, there won't be any change here because this metric is already selected. So I'm going to select another metric, which in this case will be the number of sessions on my site. To do this, I'll type Sessions in the search bar. Once located, I'll drag it to my chart configuration, and this way we can see how the metric of new users has been replaced by sessions. One of the most interesting and important features of scorecards, and indeed of almost all charts in Looker Studio, is the ability to make comparisons with previous time periods. In this case, I'm going to select the scorecard. I'll go to the configuration section, and in the other comparison options, I'll make sure that period is selected. Once this is done, I'll scroll down to the comparison date range section, where we can choose a period with which we want to make the comparison, whether it's custom or one of the default options available. I'm going to select previous period. By selecting this option, it will compare the results obtained during the selected period, which in this case is last month, with the immediately preceding period. In other words, it's comparing the results obtained in October with those from September. The comparison is displayed in percentage format. But what does this percentage indicate? This percentage shows that we've decreased by 14% in views in October compared to September. Let's do the same process with sessions. First, I'll select the session scorecard, go to the configuration, and tell it to compare with the previous period. That way, we'll also have the comparison included in this scorecard. When we open the chart menu, did you notice that there are two scorecards? What's the difference between them? I'm going to select the second one, called Scorecard with Compact Numbers, and drag it into our report. I'll configure this scorecard with the metric of sessions to see the differences between the two charts. The only difference is that this one shows abbreviated numbers, using conventional numeric abbreviations for thousands or millions. When should I use each scorecard? Generally, there's no strict rule for using them, but scorecards with abbreviated numbers are useful when we're dealing with very large figures, such as millions of results, or when we're using monetary data, like budgets in the millions of pesos or dollars. I'm going to take a specific metric to explore another of the configurations available in scorecards. For this, I'll go back to the Add a Chart section and select another scorecard, dragging it into my report. Now, I'll go to the Data section, and in the search bar, I'll type Bounce Rate. I'll select it and drag it to the configuration of my chart. I'm going to make a comparison by selecting the option to compare with the previous period. I press Apply and we're done. What happens when I select the bounce rate? Let's analyze what this means. A bounce rate shows the percentage of users who visit our website and then either go to another page or leave our site. We would expect the bounce rate to be lower, indicating that users are staying on the website. However, what this indicates is that the bounce rate has increased, and it's marked in green, indicating that this is a positive change. It may be positive, but generally speaking, a higher bounce rate is a negative indicator. So I want the increase in the bounce rate to indicate a negative change, showing the percentage comparison in red. Let's make this change. I select the chart, go to the Style section, and scroll down to the Comparison fields, where the colors are indicated. I'll make the change. I'll select the upward arrow, which is green, and choose one of the red colors from the palette. For the downward arrow, I'll do the same process, but select one of the colors from the green palette. Notice that we've reversed the style. Now it indicates that the bounce rate has gone up and is marked in red, indicating that this is a negative change compared to the previous period. Scorecards are among the easiest charts to use and the most useful when we want to present summaries of our data over a specified period. I'll see you in the next class, where we'll continue exploring other types of charts. Another type of chart is tables. To select a table, we go to Add a Chart and select the first table, dragging it onto the report. What can tables help us achieve? Tables allow us to combine multiple dimensions and metrics within the same chart. If we access the chart settings, in the Dimensions section, it is enabled for us to add more than one. The same applies to metrics. I will change the default data that the table brought us. First, I will change this dimension. I want to see the country directly. I know that the country dimension can also be visualized on a map, but we will see that later. I will also add an additional dimension, which will be page title. I'll search for this dimension and select it. And we notice something particular. Did you notice what happened? What happens if we only keep the country? I will remove page title and keep only the country. By doing this, the amount of information decreased, and it's not that the amount of data or the total amount of data has decreased. What happens here is that by adding more dimensions, I get a greater disaggregation of the information. I will add the page title dimension again, and let's observe the changes. What happened when we did this process? It disaggregated the information by each of the countries and shows me the page titles and the views each specific page received. We observe that this table is being sorted by the number of views. However, I can sort it differently and ask it to show me the order first by country, not by the number of views. I go to my chart settings. Look, there is a section called Sort that indicates it is currently sorting by views. I don't want it sorted by views. I want it sorted by the country dimension. By doing this process, the information will be displayed in alphabetical order, according to the country name. I can change this order, either descending or ascending, in the same section, depending on the need required. We observe something particular. Some countries are not identified, and they are marked as not set. This is totally normal. Not all countries from which the views come can be identified due to issues related to cookies, privacy, and other factors that prevent the direct identification of the country. What else can I do with tables? In addition to deciding the order in which I want the information to be displayed, we can choose the amount of information we need to visualize in our table. For this, I go to the chart settings, and in the number of rows section, I can choose how many rows to show in my table, whether by pages, assigning a certain number of rows to each page, or through a top N, where I can select the number of rows I want to see, either a number less than the total or the complete total. By selecting this option and scrolling within the table, I can see the different results for the number of rows selected previously. In our table, we can also use a very useful option, adding a summary row. This will allow our table to total the metrics it contains. At the beginning of the class, I mentioned that a table is useful for adding multiple dimensions and metrics. So let's do that. First, I will remove the page title dimension so that my table does not have too much crossed information. I will also add the sessions metric. Additionally, the active users metric and the new users. Now I have everything in a single table. I don't want it sorted by country. I want to see the order by views. We already know how to do that. I go to the settings part, sort, and change the country dimension to the views metric. Now I will have the order of views from lowest to highest. Let's see other variations we can have in table charts, but first, let's increase the size of our page a bit. For this, I will right-click on an empty part of the report, select Current Page Settings, then go to Style, and in Height, I will assign a size of at least 10,000 pixels. Since on this page, we will develop the different types of charts corresponding to the learning of this course. Once this action is completed, we first go to Add a Chart and select the second option, Table with Bars, dragging it into our report. Let's make sure it has the country dimension and the views metric. What is this variation useful for? It allows us to display the information in a simpler way. We can visually identify which category has the largest data. Taking the case of the country, we can quickly know which country has the most views just by the size of the bar. This variation is useful when we have more associated metrics. I will add the sessions and bounce rate metrics to my chart. As you can see, it is very visually convenient, since I don't have to identify the number itself. With the size of the bar, I can easily tell which one is superior in each metric. Why is this important? Because when applying an order to the chart, we will realize that we can only sort by one metric. We cannot sort by all of them. So if I change the order, for example, from bounce rate, we will lose the top that was previously sorted by views. And this is where it starts to make sense to have this type of chart. To find the country with the most views, I can do it more easily, or if I wanted to see the correspondence between bounce rate and views for a particular country. Otherwise, I would have had to make the comparison number by number. There's another type of table that also allows us to have a certain order of colors, or a heat map. For this, we will duplicate our table. First, we select it, go to the top section with the three dots, select More, and then Duplicate. We move our table to organize it better, and with the table selected, we go to the Chart Settings section. In the top part labeled Chart, we expand the list and select the option called Table with Heat Map. And there you go. We have changed the chart type directly from this option. Here I want to give you a warning. Be careful, as some charts are compatible while others are not. In the case of tables, we saw that there was no problem, but it can happen with other types of charts that by changing them directly from here, we might lose information. In this variation, we will no longer have a bar, but a color map, where the intensity of the color shows us what the highest result is and what the highest data we have within each of our metrics. The next type of chart we are going to see is the pie charts. We will add this chart to our report. So, we go to Add a Chart, head to the Pie section, select the first option, Pie Chart, and bring it to our report. This chart is called a pie chart due to its shape, which is very similar to the sliced pie. By default, it related the gender dimension to the sessions metric. For this case, this information works very well for me. If it brought you different information, you already know how to change it so that we can work with the same data in this class. The function of this chart is to show us the proportion or participation of the categories of our dimension over the total information. In this example, it indicates the participation of each gender in the total sessions. In a quick reading, we can determine that the unknown gender accounts for 62.1% of the total sessions. The female gender represents 17.0% of the total sessions. And finally, the male gender accounts for 20.9% of the sessions. Let's select another variation of the pie charts. To do this, we go back to the Add a Chart section and select the donut chart. By default, it related the country dimension to the views metric. This works perfectly for me to demonstrate certain configurations we can have in this chart. And between the two charts, there is only a difference in appearance, but the functionality they serve is the same, to show the participation of the categories of a dimension against a total of a metric. What other configurations can we include in this type of chart? First, we make sure our chart is selected and go to the Style section. Once there, in the Pie Chart section, we can decide from the drop-down list how many slices we want our information to be divided into. If I select 2, let's see what happens. By doing this, the chart only shows me the information for the country with the most views, which in this case is the United States, and groups the remaining ones into a category called Others. However, this happens because I have the Group Others option activated. If I deactivate it, it will show me information only for the United States and Canada, omitting the other countries. When we expand the slices list, we notice that it has a maximum of 20 divisions, and this is because the use of pie charts should only be for dimensions that do not have too many categories, as the information becomes very difficult to read. And let's select the maximum number of divisions and verify this. Notice how the information feels very visually overloaded. Another configuration we can change is the way the chart presents the information to us. To do this, in the same Style section, we go to the Label part. In this section, we can choose None, which will only visually display the portions of our chart. Percentage, which by default will show us the participation percentage of each of the categories. Label, which will show us only the category name. And finally, Value, which instead of showing us the percentage participation, will show us the amount of the category value. See you in the next class. The next type of chart we are going to learn about is the bar chart, and we will see where it is used and how to read it. To add a bar chart, we go to our Add a Chart tab, navigate to the Bar section, and select the first option called Column Chart. Okay. Notice that by default, it brought me the same data I have in the pie chart. However, this is not advisable. It's not that it can't be done. It can be done, but it is not recommended to use a bar chart to show the same information that we could show with a pie chart. What is the bar chart used for? The bar chart is generally used to relate dimensions that do not represent a total. We see that this dimension has its categories, which represent the total data, which in this case are the views. However, we do not want to show that in the bars. This could easily be shown with a pie chart. Here I want to show categories that do not belong to a total. So I will change the dimension that is being displayed. I will show a dimension that is not complementary or related. So I select my chart and will change the dimension from gender to event name. What happened here? When I marked the event name as a dimension, the chart seemed to be showing us incorrect data. But something happens. We need to maintain coherence in what we are showing, both in dimension and in metric. That's why it is very important that we always know our data sources. Although this is not a Google Analytics course, it is important that we know something about analytics, and that with the data we are going to work with in our reports, we have a clear idea of what is happening. If I'm selecting event name, I cannot directly relate it to views. What I should do here is change the metric from views to event count. Notice that the chart changed, and now has coherence between the relationship of dimension and metric. Now I no longer have the number of views, but the number of events corresponding to event name. Why do I tell you that this is not a related category? Because a person may have triggered more than one event while browsing the website. For example, when a person enters the page directly and navigates through it, they might have registered a page view event, but they could also have filled out a form, viewed a promotion, or scrolled. But this is not necessarily exclusive. In contrast, we cannot say that a person who entered my page is both male and female at the same time. If it is one, it is not the other. This does not mean that we cannot use the bar chart for that purpose, but it is recommended for cases where the pie chart cannot fulfill its role. Now, let's look at a variation that appears in the bar chart. We go to Add a Chart and see that there are different types of bar charts. We have stacked columns and 100% stacked columns. Let's select the stacked column chart and see what happens. When is this chart used? Notice that it brings me a very good example for using this chart. A stacked column chart is used when we want to relate two dimensions. For example, here we see the age dimension also related to the gender dimension against the views. So look at what happens here. We have the age dimension as the main dimension and a breakdown dimension, which in this case is gender. We will see this later. We will learn to manage breakdown dimensions in a more advanced way. But bringing this graph into play, we see that the age dimension can also be broken down by the gender dimension, and this is where a stacked column chart starts to make sense, as we can have a breakdown of another related dimension. For example, here we have two demographic data points. Now, let's look at the next variation of the bar charts. The next type is the 100% stacked column chart. Let's select it and place it here. Let's make sure it brings us the same dimensions we saw in the previous chart, so we can observe its uses and the differences between the two. Once we have the chart set up, we can see how it presents the information. Let's imagine that the 100% stacked column chart behaves like a pie chart. So, what can we read from this? This type of chart shows us the percentage share of each gender within each age range. It's like performing a breakdown and making a pie chart for each of the age dimensions related to the sex dimension. The difference with the previous chart is that in the stacked column chart, we see total or aggregated data, whereas here we are seeing the percentage of participation over a total. The other types of bar charts are the same as we have seen with these examples, except that their orientation is horizontal instead of vertical, but they serve the same function. Now, let's look at another type of chart that is interesting when we want to associate two or more dimensions. The tree map. You already know the process. We go to the part to add a chart, look for the tree map, and drag it to our report. This chart helps us relate two or more hierarchical dimensions. I will select an example that allows us to easily understand how it works. I want to know from which device users are visiting, desktop, tablet, or mobile. From those devices, I will also see which browser they are using. So let's get started. I want to have device category as my dimension. Now, I will add the second dimension. I will search for browser and add it. I will increase the size of my chart to better visualize the information. Next, I will reduce the amount of data displayed since multiple browsers appear on each device with minimal participation, making the information unreadable. To reduce the amount of information, I will go to the chart settings and change the total rows from 500 to 25. Correct. How can we read this chart? I am considering the device category and browser, relating them to a metric, the number of views. First, let's observe that the chart shows a total number of views in the All classification, which groups all categories. In this case, there are 376,204 views. These views will be divided by the device category, desktop, tablet, and mobile, in relation to the browser used in each category. If I focus on desktop, I will see the total number of views generated through this device. By hovering over the browsers used, the chart will divide the total views from desktop by each browser, with Google Chrome being the most used browser. The same happens with the other devices. The chart first shows the total views generated through the device and then breaks it down by browser. As you can see, the intensity of the color and the size of the rectangle indicate the amount of the assigned metric. We can continue adding dimensions, and the information will keep getting hierarchically organized and broken down. However, unless we need something very specific, it is not advisable to do so, as it can become unreadable. Let's test it, and I will also add the gender dimension. I have added the dimension, but nothing happened, because we need to make an additional configuration. We go to Levels to Show, and increase it to 3 so that it shows the 3 levels of dimensions we have configured. Now, all the information is displayed. However, as I mentioned earlier, the information breaks down so much that it can be difficult to read. See you in the next class. The next chart we're going to learn to use is the line chart. We'll select Add a Chart, Line Chart, and we'll place it right here. What is a line chart generally used for? Line charts are used to relate several metrics against a dimension, just like we did with a table. But here we're going to do it in a more graphical way. Let's look at something very important and quite helpful: learning to manage the axes in line charts. Give me a moment and I'll explain everything to you. For now, let's change the metrics and dimensions that come by default. I will change to the age dimension. Additionally, I will select the metric of views. I think this is a good metric, and I want it to be delivered in ascending order. Okay, so here we can see a line of age ranges, organized by the number of views from lowest to highest. What's interesting about using line charts is that we can add more metrics. For this case, I will add the bounce rate. And this is where the chart will start to make sense. Let's enlarge this chart, and we'll notice something. Notice that graphically, if I'm not very detail-oriented, I see that it only shows me the blue line corresponding to the views part. However, the bounce rate is being shown, but it's very low on the axis. Why does this happen? Because the bounce rate is a percentage. It's a rate. So if I relate it on the same axis as the views, it will seem to be very low due to the disproportion between one metric and another. We don't want to give that impression. So what we're going to do is configure the axes of the line charts. We'll go to the Style section. Notice that it shows us the series we have, which correspond to the metrics we've added to the chart. So, we will have Series 1, which in this case are the views. What interests us here is, in the Axis section, to assign the axis on which we want our metric to be displayed. I want to manage it on the left axis. But for Series 2, which corresponds to the bounce rate, I don't want it to be shown on the same axis as the views. I want to move it to the other axis so it can have its own proportion. So I'll select the right axis. Now, look how things change. Notice that the bounce rate now has its own axis and is no longer displayed as a horizontal line perpendicular to the x-axis. It now has its own y-axis scale. It can now be displayed in a slightly easier and more graphical way, and we can see how it evolves. What's interesting about all this? Here we can have the relationship of one dimension over two variables and see how it acts across different categories. For example, we could know what happened in the age range of 35 to 44 years or in the 18 to 24 age range. We could continue adding more metrics, as long as they meet these conditions, that they are on one of the axis proportions. Let's add another metric, new users. Notice that although they are very close, the x-axis added them correctly and is showing them on the right axis. Let's change this new users metric for one that is a bit higher. I'll take the sessions. And look how the information is displayed and how it aligns with an axis that goes along with the same proportion in the data scale. What's interesting about these line charts is that we can also play with combined charts. So I'm going to switch to a variation of the same. I don't want just a line chart anymore. Now I want to see another variation. I'll go to Add a Chart, and in the Line Chart section, I'll select the Combo Chart. So I'll add it right here. Let's change the metrics and dimensions it comes with by default. I'll take the same ones from the previous example. So for this case, I'll take age. I'll change this metric to views. And I'll also add my bounce rate. Let's change the style, and here we'll be able to select what I want to display as a line and what I want to display as a bar. I want the views to be shown as bars. We see that Series 1, which is the views, is being displayed as a line. I don't want it to show as a line, I want it to show as a bar, as we had said. In addition to that, I want its axis to be the left one. On the other hand, for Series 2, which is the bounce rate, I want it to be displayed on the right axis. And I don't want it to be a bar. I want it to be a line. So I can see how the different categories, in this case the ages, display the views. Additionally, we see how the line corresponding to the bounce rate crosses them. These charts are useful for making quick readings. And, as I mentioned at the beginning, for combining different metrics we wish to add to a certain dimension. Let's look at another variation of this type of chart. Within the line charts, we'll also see the stacked combo chart. What is this going to be used for? We'll see that in a moment. First, let's change all the metrics and dimensions we have here. I'm going to change this dimension to device brand. And I'll change these metrics. I want to see the number of active users. And I also want to see the number of new users. And I also want to see the bounce rate. Done. Let's change how this chart looks so you can understand how it works. Similar to how we've been working, let's go to the Style section. So for Series 1, which corresponds to the active users, I want it to be a bar. For Series 2, which corresponds to new users, I'll also view it as a bar. And for Series 3, corresponding to the bounce rate, I want it to take the form of a line. Additionally, I'll configure it to be displayed on the right axis. Done, our chart is now configured. Now, how should I read this chart? Notice that in the stacked bar charts, what it shows me is the number of active users and the number of new users. So, notice that in a single bar, it's showing me the total number of users, since it sums both the active users and the new users. It's also showing me the bounce rate on the line against the device brand. If we want to see it in a slightly easier way, let's change the device brand to the gender dimension. And we'll change it. Here we can see it more clearly. Notice that in the unknown gender category, the number of active users is 54,155, new users 52,125, and the bounce rate is 51.62%. When you combine these bars, or decide which metric to use with bars, you need to ensure that these metrics are proportional and belong to a common category. In this case, new users and active users show us the total users. See you in the next class. We have made significant progress in this module on using charts in Looker Studio. In this class, we will learn how to use the so-called gauge chart. This chart is another tool that allows us to bring aggregates of our metrics. However, it is used to establish an indicator or target to measure their performance. To use it, you already know the process. We select Add a Chart and then choose Gauge. In this case, the chart shows the metric of total users, which is ideal for developing the example. In fact, it works well with any metric. What's interesting about this chart are the configurations we can make regarding the ranges we want to display. To do this, I select the chart and go to the Style section. In the Range Limits option, we can add different numeric ranges. I will add the first one and set it to 50,000. Once I set it, notice how the chart is shaded in that range, which aims to allow us to visually establish the performance levels of our metric. Now, I will add another range and set it to 71,000. See how they are delineated within the chart. The goal is for us to visualize one or more control zones. We can change the colors of those ranges so that they are clearer. I will select a bright color to make it easy to distinguish. At the beginning, I mentioned that this chart is used not only to establish ranges, but also to set a target against the metric we are working with. To do this, in the same Style section, I will go to the Target option and check the box Show Target. Once this is done, a box is enabled where we can set the desired target. I will designate it as 60,000. Now, when we approach the chart, we will not only see the ranges we previously established, but also the target. Now, we will work with another variation of this type of chart. We add a new chart and select Gauge with Ranges. This chart is basically the same as the previous one, but it comes with some preset ranges by default. I invite you to explore this chart with other metrics to practice its use. See you in the next class. Continuing with this series, where we are discussing the different types of charts offered by Looker Studio, today we will see another interesting chart, the bullet chart. This chart allows us to display a summarized metric against certain ranges. Its operation is very similar to the gauge chart we saw in the previous class. Let's take a look. You already know our usual process. We go to Add a Chart, select the bullet chart, and drag it to our report. I'm going to drag it here, and let's see what function it serves. First, let's change the metric that it brought by default. I don't want this metric, so I'll set another one. Views. Perfect. Now, what does this chart allow us to do? This chart will let us see the total views. In the background, we will have a series of ranges that will show the achievement of specific objectives, very similar to what we did in the previous class. This includes not only the target, but also the ranges from the lower to the upper limit. So, what is this used for? I will show you. For example, if we analyze the total of our metric by hovering over the chart, it indicates that it is 442,590. Now, I will set a target for this metric over a specific period. Let's assume the target is 300,000. Notice that the setup is practically the same as what we did in the gauge chart from the previous class. I will add my target of 300,000. Now I'll establish some range limits that will allow us to identify a series of critical points. I'll set the first one at 75,000. Let's see how it adjusts. We already have the first one. Now let's configure the second one. I want my second range to be closer to the target of 300,000. Therefore, I will set it to 250,000. And finally, I need to set the upper range where the metric exceeds the target. And passing it would be significant, or indicate that the target is being exceeded. For this case, I will set it to 400,000 views for this period. Now, notice how the chart is configured. First, in the shaded area, we have that critical range we defined. Second, there is the intermediate range, which goes up to 250,000. And finally, we have the upper range at 400,000. We can also see the target cut at 300,000. And from there, we can measure how well the target has been met. This chart, like the others, can be styled. You can change the colors to improve visibility and get a better perspective. However, its fundamental use is to track metrics and compare them to the target and the critical ranges we have defined. All right, we've reached the next module. In this module, we are going to learn one of the most important tools in Looker Studio, the use of filters and regular expressions. This will allow us to make a series of changes and manage our reports in a more advanced way, as well as create custom dimensions and metrics. The first thing we're going to learn is how to handle filters before moving on to regular expressions. To do this, we'll start by creating a new report. In this new report, we're going to use the Google Analytics source, the demo account, and select the Google Analytics 4 property of the Google Merch Shop. Let's change the name of this report. Here we'll title it Filters and Rejects. Perfect. Let's delete this table. It brought by default, as we won't need it for now. First, let's add a date range control and select the previous month period. Next, let's add a donut chart. We'll make sure that the dimension our chart contains is gender, and in its metric, we'll bring in the metric for views. Okay, let's see what this chart is showing us. Here we're seeing a breakdown of views by the gender of users who visit the website. However, you might notice that there's a portion, and it's considerable, that shows up as unknown gender. In my case, I could say or assume that this information is not relevant. Although it's very relevant, just to clarify, this is just a practical example. I want to say that for this application, this information is not relevant. To do this, I'll create a filter that allows me to exclude it and only show information on male and female gender. Let's proceed. To do this, I'll go to the chart configuration and scroll down to the filter section, where I'll add a filter. When I do this, the filter configuration menu appears. The first thing I'll do is assign a name to the filter. Make sure the names are descriptive. If you're already working with multiple filters, you'll need to identify them easily and know what function they're performing. The name I'll assign is Gender Exclude Unknown. At the outset, the filter gives me two main options, include or exclude. For the example we're developing, we want to exclude the unknown gender. So, I'm going to select the exclude option. Now, the category I want to exclude is in the gender dimension, so in the field called Select a Field, I'll specify which metric or dimension I want to pull information from. In my case, I'll look for the gender dimension. The next thing we need to do is choose a condition to identify the information. We have several options that work as comparison operators. I'll quickly explain each one. Equal to compares if one value is exactly the same as another. For example, if you want to filter only the products with a price of $100, you'd use price equals sign $100. Contains checks if a value contains a specific string of text. For example, if you want to filter clients whose name contains Garcia within its characters. Starts with checks if a value begins with a specific string of text. For instance, if you want to filter cities that start with San. Regex P match uses regular expressions for more complex text pattern comparisons. We'll learn this in the following classes. For example, if you want to filter email addresses that have a .com domain, regex P contains, similar to regex P match, but checks if a text string contains a regular pattern. Example, if you want to filter names that contain a sequence of 3 consecutive vowels, you'd use name regex P contains IU. This allows us to check if a value is present in a list of values. Example, if you want to filter products in the categories electronics or fashion, is null. Checks if a value is null, meaning no value is assigned. Example, if you want to filter clients who have no address, you'd use address is null. For this case, we're going to select the equal to option because we know exactly which category we want to exclude, and we only want to exclude this category of unknown gender. To do this, I'll write the exact name, taking into account case sensitivity. Remember, it must be exact. If you don't have the exact information, or if there are many categories that start or contain that name, it's better to use other options. The exact name of my category is unknown. I'll click Save and that's it. When we return to the chart, we can see that the unknown gender has been excluded and it's now only showing the percentages for male and female gender. Let's make one more change to our filter. Look, we can enter here and edit directly. But in the first classes, when we were exploring the interface, we learned the location of the menus. So let's do it through the Resources menu. We select Manage Filters and go to Edit our filter. Now, I wanted to perform another action. I needed to exclude both unknown gender and male gender. So I'll add another condition. Notice that here we can add or and conditions. Since I wanted to exclude both values, I'll select and. If I wanted it to exclude one or the other, I'd select the or condition. Notice that another configuration has been enabled again, so we already know the process. We select exclude gender equal to, and here we add our second value, which is male. We save, and that's it. When we go back to the chart, we can see that both unknown gender and male gender have been excluded. Now the entire 100% corresponds to the female gender. To explore some additional filter configurations, let's add 3 more charts. I'll take a scorecard to see the total summary of views. Additionally, I'll add a second scorecard, which I'll configure with sessions. And finally, I'll add a time series chart where I can see the views trend over the configured time period. Now, I'll add a new page. You already know how to do it. On this new page, let's just add a chart. I'll only add a scorecard that brings in views again. I'll add a date range control on this page so that we can have the same date range as on the previous page. And we'll select last month's option. Perfect. Let's go back to the previous page. When applying filters, we can do so at 3 levels. The first one we've been seeing is applying it at the chart level, which means the filter only works for a particular chart. The next level is applying it at the page level. When this setting is applied, all charts on the current page will be affected. Finally, configuring a report-level filter means the filter applies to all pages within it. Let's see how it works. I'll select the time series chart, and in the filter option, I'll add a filter and select the one we created. But first, I want you to pay attention to how the chart looks and how it will look after applying the filter. We see that the maximum peak is above 25,000 views. However, when applied, the maximum peak reaches around 6,000. Let's make the next application at the page level. To do this, we right-click on Current Page Settings, and on the right menu, an option appears where we can add a filter. We select our filter and look. It's already been applied to the whole page, and as you can see, all the charts on this page are affected. Now let's make the last configuration at the report level. To do this, we right-click again and select Report Settings, and similarly, the filter option appears. We select our filter once again and see the results. To confirm that it's working correctly, both the Views scorecard on this page and the one we created should show the same results. Let's go to our second page, and indeed it shows the same information, confirming the proper use of filters. See you in the next class, where we'll learn to handle regular expressions, which also help us filter and manage information in a much more advanced way. Welcome to this new module. In this module, we'll cover everything related to controls, which will allow us to manipulate our reports. But first, the initial step is to create a small report so we can work with it and see the effects that controls have on it. Let's create a new report and add our data source, which is the same Google Analytics 4 data source we've been using throughout the course. We'll use the demo account and add it. Perfect. Now we have it in our report. Let's delete this table. First, let's change the report title. We'll name it Controls. Perfect. Next, we'll set a sufficient page size to avoid space issues. For this, you know the process. Current page settings, and we'll increase the height. 1500 pixels should be more than enough. Now, let's add a series of charts. Since we're already familiar with scorecards, we want some totals. I'll configure views as the first metric. I'll add a comparison period to it. You'll see what we'll use it for later. The comparison period will be the previous period. Perfect. We'll copy the charts Ctrl-C, Ctrl-5 and assign sessions to this new scorecard. We also want to see the number of users, so we'll bring in the total users metric. And also active users. Remember that we're copying the charts and changing the metric. Lastly, let's add the total number of events. To complement this, let's add a time series chart. So we'll go here to the time series charts. We'll select one and configure views as the main metric. I also want to add a comparison to the previous period for this chart. Perfect. To complement the report, let's add a table that maps page title and views. We'll configure it so the summary row shows the total, And we can see that the views broken down by page title match the total shown on the scorecard. Let's add a map chart. And we'll relate the country with views. This looks great. And lastly, we'll add a donut chart. We'll configure it with the browser dimension along with the views metric. Perfect. That's it. For now, we have our report ready to work with. So, I'll see you in the upcoming classes, where we'll go over each of the different control types in Looker Studio and study their effects on our report. Now that we have our small report ready to work with controls, we'll start with the first one, which I consider one of the most important, the date range control. First, let's add it to our report. We'll go to the Add a Control section and select Date Range Control. Then, we'll place it anywhere on the current page. This control has some interesting features. The first is that when you select this control automatically, if no period has been assigned, it will assign a default period. That's why when you interact with it. Look, it defaults to AutoDate range. This automatic period refers to the last 28 days. Whenever the automatic period is selected, it will use the current date as a reference against the previous 28 days. So always keep that in mind. I'll select a period in two different ways, so we can see how this control works effectively. First, I'll select the period from October 1st to 31, and let's see what happens. Notice that when I select my period, the information in all the charts in the report starts to be manipulated. To understand the curiosity I'm talking about, I'll pause here on our evolution chart, and I want us to keep something in mind, and you'll understand the importance of having added it. First of all, we have two lines displayed on the chart. The first refers to the data obtained for the current date, and the second shows the data compared to the previous period. Look, if I pause at October 1st, 2024, it is comparing it to August 31st, 2024. However, the comparison should be with September 1st, because I'm comparing my current month against the previous month. But I want you to understand that Looker Studio operates this way. When I manually selected from October 1st to 31, I'm telling it to select a range of 31 days, and what it will do is compare that with the 31 days immediately prior, which corresponds to August 31st to September 30th, and that's why this information is generated this way. Now, how can I solve this? When I want to compare my month against the last month, I don't want to compare by the number of days, but by the closed month. Notice that this control has predefined periods. For what purpose? To avoid discrepancies in the data we are seeing. So first, let's notice something. Look at what the scorecard says when I manually selected the period. That views are down 17% compared to the immediately previous period. However, now let's see what happens when I select the predefined periods that Looker Studio offers. Now, I will select last month using the predefined ranges. It seems to indicate that it's the same period I'd selected manually. But let's see how it's different when I click Apply. Notice how the way the views are displayed has changed. Now it shows that it was only a 14% increase compared to last month. Now let's look at our evolution chart and position ourselves on October 1st, 2024. As you can see, it's now correctly comparing October 1st with September 1st. This is something you must be very clear about when making comparisons or when selecting periods. Let me show you something else. When you enter a report, for example, I'll refresh this page and let's see what happens. The period I had previously selected is lost and reverts to the default automatic period. How can we avoid this? For example, if you're working on a monthly report and want this period to stay while you're developing a report, so it doesn't get lost every time you enter or refresh the page, what we need to do is select the Date Range control. And here in the settings, we'll configure it directly. So we'll take the same configuration we had earlier, which was for last month. We'll apply it, and it should maintain the configuration we assign. Now I'll refresh, and let's see what happens. Notice that our configuration is still maintained. Now you understand how this date range control works. I encourage you to do several exercises to see how this control works, as it is very important to keep it in mind within Looker Studio. Continuing with the development of controls within Looker Studio, in this class, we will learn about the next control, the drop-down list. To do this, we will duplicate the pages so that we can have each of the controls we learn about on a different page. Let's go to the Page section and duplicate the current page. All right, we have duplicated it. First of all, I want us to assign names to the pages so that they don't get lost in our learning process. So the first one we created will be renamed Date Range Control. And the second one we are currently working on will be named Drop-Down List. Perfect. We will continue to keep the date range control we saw in the last class. It is very important that we have a well-defined date and that we know the interval our information is covering. So we will always maintain this period control across the different controls we will learn. Let's add our drop-down list. What does this drop-down list allow us to do? Well, the drop-down list allows us to have a dimension to filter different data, and that dimension, containing categories, will enable us to filter by categories. For example, in this case, it brings the date, but I'm not interested in the date because I already have my period control. It doesn't make sense for me to bring the date within a list. What I'm going to do is add the dimension of country. Perfect. Now, with this configuration, when we expand the list, we can filter by each of the countries. I can specify that I only want to see one country, and look, all the charts and elements within the report will be filtered just for that country. Remember that the map was showing us information from other countries. Now, it is only showing the information for the country I selected in the drop-down list. Similarly, I can select a series of countries. Look, I'm checking off the different countries for which I need information. And we see that our entire report adapts to those filters I am establishing within this control. I'll select all countries again to leave the drop-down list at its default setting. There is something interesting we can also do with drop-down lists. When I expand this list, it brings not only the dimensions, but also an associated metric. So we can have quick access to the information or a quick reading regarding a metric we determine is important to assign to this drop-down list. For example, here I have the views. I can change these views, for instance, to sessions. To do this, I go to the configuration section, and in the metric, I select the one I wish to implement. In this case, for the sake of the example, I will simply change it to sessions. Now, if we go to the drop-down list, we see that it has changed to sessions. For each of the countries, it now shows the number of sessions. We can also choose the order in which the information is displayed. In the Order section of the configuration menu, I can choose to sort it either by the country dimension or by the sessions metric. If I choose to sort by country, the order will be alphabetical, allowing me to control whether I want it to be ascending or descending. When sorted in ascending order, it will display from AZ. And if I choose descending, it will show from ZA. If I select sessions as the sorting metric, it will assign a numeric order, showing the country with the most sessions to the one with the least, or vice versa. Another configuration I can implement is a top limit. By configuring a top limit, I can indicate that it should only show a specific number of countries. If I choose 10, it will display the top 10 countries according to the order I assigned earlier. I will ensure that the order is set by sessions in descending order so that it shows from highest to lowest. Now, if we go to our drop-down list, we see that it is indeed only displaying the top 10 countries with the highest number of sessions. The others are grouped into a category called All Others. There are other functionalities I can use when implementing the drop-down list control. For example, I will select My Control, and if I go to the Style section, we can enable or disable the search box. Look, when you expand the list, suppose you're working with a lot of information, or that this dimension has many categories. and you want to select a specific one. I want to see only the views for Colombia, but first let's disable the top 10, as it would not show me Colombia's information. Now, if I type Colombia in the search bar, it automatically brings up the related field, and if I select the only option, my report is configured based on that control. This option can be enabled or disabled. If I disable it, it will no longer appear, and I won't be able to do that search, but I can re-enable it, and I'll have my search box back. Similarly, we also have the option for individual selection, which I can enable or disable. What this will do is allow me to select just one of the values in the drop-down list. I won't be able to make a multiple selection, so I'm going to disable this option, and now I can make a multiple selection. In this class, we are going to work on our next control. For that, you already know the methodology. First, we will duplicate this page. Once duplicated, we will remove the drop-down list. Next, we will configure the names of the pages we currently have. We will name this page Input Box. For this, we will add a control and select the one called Input Box. What does this control allow us to do? This control allows us to receive a value from a category within a dimension or control field, and based on that value we input, the entire report will be filtered. For this class, we will continue using the example of country. So, we will select the dimension of country in the control field. Now, let's say I only want to see the data corresponding to Canada. To do this, I will type Canada in the search box, and let's see what happens. Notice that it doesn't show me any data. After typing, all the graphs appear as if they have no information. Why do you think this situation arises? I invite you to pause the class and think about what factor could have caused this situation. Okay, I'll give you the answer. Let's go to the configuration part, and in search type, the option equals is enabled. Since this option is enabled, we must write the exact name of the category. In the example we developed, I wrote Canada with a lowercase first letter. However, in the data source information, the first letter is uppercase. So let's make this change and see what happens. Look, now it shows me the information for Canada. As you saw, with this setting enabled, we need to ensure that we write the information without any differences in typing. But I can configure it differently. For example, I can configure this control to search by the characters it starts with, and I don't necessarily have to write the whole word. In the case of Canada, I can simply write CAN, and it will understand or search for all views related to that country or countries whose names start with CAN. It's worth noting that in this case, the only country that starts with CAN is Canada. Let's proceed to make that configuration. In search type, we will change it to starts with. Now in the search box, I will simply write CAN and press enter. And look, the entire report changed to show Canada. Now let's see what happens when I type COL. It shows me the information related to Colombia. The whole report updated according to the category of Colombia that we just selected. We can verify this by going to the map chart, and we can see that only this country is selected. Now I'll change the configuration to the search type contains. With this configuration, we can apply a filter for countries that contain the series of characters I write in any part of their name. In the search box, I will write nada. And look, it shows me all the information related to Canada. What if I want to see two countries at once? For that, in the search type, I will change from contains to in. I will continue with the example of the two countries we've been working with. So now simply separating them with a comma is enough to input the series of values by which I want to filter. So in the search box, I will first write Canada Colombia, and press Enter. And there we go, my information is updated. If I go to the map chart we have in the report, you can see that both countries are selected. As you can see, you can configure this search filter as you wish. Whether it starts with a certain character, contains any part of the characters, even using regular expressions, or multiple values at once. Now you know how to use this control. As always, I encourage you to practice with as many examples as you can think of. See you in the next class. Continuing with our series of controls, we are going to work on a new one. For this, we already know our methodology. What we will do is duplicate this page and proceed to change the name. This one will be called Advanced Filter. Perfect. We will remove the control we had in the previous class and work with this new control, which I can tell you is very similar to the one we studied in the last class. Let's go to the part to add a control and select the one called Advanced Filter. First of all, we will change the control field, where we will continue working with the dimension of country. We will keep working with country because it is a dimension that has a series of values that allow us to easily view the information and the modifications that are made. At the beginning of the class, I mentioned that this control is very similar to the one we saw in the last class. But what is the difference between the two? Remember that in the previous one, we had to select the search type from the chart configuration. However, in this new control, we can make that change directly from the control and not from its configuration. What would be the advantage of using this control instead of the one we saw in the last class? When you are presenting or sharing a report, and it is in view mode, the person or people viewing the report will be able to filter directly from here since they will not have editor permissions and therefore will not have access to its configurations. So I will first select equals as the search type and type Canada again. And as in the last class, it shows me the views of Canada. Now I can change the search type to contains, and I will simply write nada to see what happens. It will only show me the information for Canada, because Canada is the only country that contains this series of characters. As you can see, it works the same way as the control we saw in the last class. Its search types are the same and serve the same purpose. Let's enter view mode, so the report is displayed as if a person without editing permissions were viewing it, or as if we were presenting the report. In view mode, I can make the same selection of search types. I will select in and take the example of the two countries, Colombia and Canada. Now, if we look at the map, you can see that it is functioning correctly. It is not necessary for us to have editing or administrator permissions, as in the previous filter, where we had to change the configuration. The use we give to one or the other will depend on how you want the user experience in the report to be, whether you want the user to have control to select the search type or if you want to assign a predefined search type. See you in the next class. Welcome to this new class. I hope you are enjoying and learning a lot from the development of this course. Continuing with our series of controls, the next one we are going to work on is the checkbox. For this, let's follow the methodology we already know. First, we will duplicate this page. Then we will change the name to checkbox. Perfect. We will remove the control we were previously using and add our new control, which is the checkbox. I will add it here, and initially, it tells me that there is an error. I'm going to add a control field, which could be the city. And look, nothing happens. It still presents me with the same error. Why? This happens because a checkbox does not accept this type of information. As its name suggests, it is a checkbox. Therefore, it will not accept common names for dimensions. Instead, it must be a Boolean value. In the resources for this class, I have left you a reading so you can understand how Booleans work within Looker Studio. But for the present example, we will work with one so you can see how this type of control is used. So for that, what I am going to do is not use any of the dimensions here, but rather add a calculated field. As a quick explanation about Booleans before we continue, these are elements that take either the value of true or false when a certain condition is met. Now the checkbox starts to make more sense. What it will allow us to do is verify through it whether that value is met or not. Let's proceed to develop the example. The first thing I'm going to do is assign a name to our new calculated dimension. I will name it validator. I have prepared an example whose function is to validate whether any of the countries contain the string states. To do this, we will use a series of simple functions available within Looker Studio. In the last class of the previous module, I left you a series of functions with their corresponding explanations, so we will use one of them. We will start by writing a statement called if, and a parenthesis will appear. Inside the parenthesis, we will write the statement contains underscore text. Again, a parenthesis will appear, in which we will pass two parameters separated by a comma. The first will be from where we want to obtain the information, in this case, from the country dimension. And the second argument is the string we want to verify, which for my case is states. Outside the parentheses, we add a comma, and then the reserved word true, followed by another comma, and then add the reserved word false. And that's it. With that, we have constructed this statement, which will validate whether any of the values within the country dimension contain the text states. If it does, it will assign the value true. If it doesn't, it will assign the value false. As you can see, this syntax we used is similar to what we saw in the regex contains class. You can go back to that class and check that we also worked with Boolean values there. Let's apply it and see what happens. What happens when I activate the checkbox? I click on it and look, it changed my entire report. Now what I'm going to do is check my map and look, it indeed only selected the United States, the country that contains the string we designated, states. If I deactivate it, it will select all the countries that are not the United States. So look, now it excluded the United States and only included the countries that are not the United States. That's the magic of having a checkbox, where we can make a very precise exclusion with just one click. See you in the next class. Now let's look at another very important topic, creating metrics and dimensions through calculated fields. To do this, we'll create a new report. As you already know, we'll keep working with the Google Analytics 4 data source. Which we'll name Metric and Dimension Creation. Once we're inside the report, we start by adding a control. The default control is the date range control. Okay, perfect. Let's start with metric creation. For this, we add a chart. In this case, I'm going to choose a scorecard and change the default metric to the active user's metric. Let's add another card. And we assign it the new user's metric. Okay. When do we use a custom metric? This is used when we want to create a new metric that isn't available and that we can build from the data source. Now, suppose I want to display the sum of active users and new users in another card. If I don't have this metric, I need to create it. So let's do that. We go to this section, select Create Field, and name it Created Users. And here, I'll create the formula for this new metric. You'll see that I can use all mathematical formulas here. Let's say that created users will be the sum of active users plus new users. Okay, and we apply the changes. Now you'll see it's displaying the results corresponding to this sum, equal to those users. I can apply the same settings to this new metric as I would to a native metric from Google Analytics. So I assign it a comparison period and want it to compare with the previous period. And look, just like with a native metric, we can apply this kind of configuration. Now, let's say I want to bring this metric into a time series chart. Then I'll copy the formula I used. I'll insert a new chart. This will be a time series. I'll change the metric to a custom metric. So we repeat the process we followed with the previous chart. I'll specify that I want to create a field, and I'll name it Created Users, just as we did in the previous chart. And I'll paste the formula I copied earlier. And that's it. You'll see that my new Created Users metric is working correctly in this chart. As I mentioned before, we can work with any arithmetic operation. Let's make a change. In this case, I'll replace the sum with a division. I apply it, and you'll see it's effectively a division. Now, I want this division to display as a percentage rather than an absolute number. To do this, I go to the Data Type section and select Percentage. OK, and now the metric is displayed as a percentage. Let's set it back to how it was and display it as an integer in Data Type. I want to do a new calculation. For that, we add another chart. And again, I'll select a scorecard and configure it with the Items Purchased metric. Perfect. Now I want to create a new metric based on these purchased items. I want to know how many of these purchased items were bought per user. So I want to calculate that. Let's add another scorecard. In this new scorecard, we create a new calculated field, which I'll name Items Per User. All right. In the console, we first bring in Items Purchased and divide it by total users. Apply and we're done. Now, you'll see it shows how many items were purchased per total number of users visiting the website. In this case, it's 0.27 items per visitor arriving on my website. Now you've learned how to create your metrics. Remember that you can always apply any functions you need. In the regular expressions module, there is a class explaining what each available function in Looker Studio is used for. Now, let's look at how dimensions are created. In the previous class, we looked at how to create a series of metrics. In this class, we'll learn how to create dimensions. Although we've already had an introduction, we'll cover other concepts to give you a more complete view of how to create additional dimensions. Let's start with an example by adding a new chart. We'll use a table since it's easier to see our dimensions and the changes made to them. We'll make sure the dimension is page title. For the metric, we'll continue working with views. Now, suppose I want to make a classification, specifically creating a dimension that classifies into a series of categories based on the number of views. If they meet a certain number of views, they're classified into a dimension as met, approved, good, or bad. We'll define that next. We'll add a new dimension. To do this, we'll create a field and name it classification. We'll use a concept we learned earlier, case when. So, we start with the clause, case when. Here we'll add two classifications. When views are greater than or equal to 10,000, we'll assign the category good, otherwise the classification will be bad. Let's continue. After the case when clause, we select the metric we want information from, in this case views. We add the condition that views are greater than or equal to 10,000. Then we add the then clause to assign the category value, and in double quotes, we assign the value good. Next, we add an else, and in double quotes, the classification it will take if the previous condition isn't met. In this case, bad. We finish with an end, and that's it. Look at what happens if we check views that exceed 10,000 are indeed classified under the category good, and those that don't are classified as bad. Let's look at another example. We'll do the same classification, but in a different way. I want you to consider it to start understanding conditionals and become familiar with dimension creation. You can also complement this with the class on functions in the filters and regular expressions module. We'll create a field called classification 2. In this case, instead of case when, we'll use the if clause. Here I'll type if. We add the views metric. The statement is greater than or equal to 5,000. We type a comma, and in double quotes type good, indicating it should be classified as good. Then we type another comma, and in double quotes, bad, indicating that if not, it should be classified as bad. Notice the syntax has changed, and it's even quicker. We apply it. See, it now shows that views equal to or greater than 5,000 are classified as good, and others as bad. Let's do another classification example. For this case, we'll create a new field called classification 3. Again, we use the if clause. Within the parentheses, we select the views metric. For this example, we'll define a range. We'll say that if views are between, for instance, 25,000 and 50,000, the classification will be good. To do this, we use the between statement, type 2,500, then the and clause, and the number 5,000. Next, we type a comma, and the classification in double quotes, in this case, good. We type another comma, and the other category, bad, also in double quotes. Done. By implementing this classification, we assume that this range is the best possible classification for views, without going above or below. If they're above 5,000, we'll consider it bad. And if they're below 2,500, we'll also consider it bad. Remember, it's just a hypothetical example. We apply it? Done. You'll see that views exceeding 5,000 are classified as bad, as well as those below 2,500, while views between 2,500 and 5,000 are classified as good. In dimension creation, you can apply many of the formulas and functions we covered in the regular expressions module, depending on your case study. In this class, you will learn how to use time intelligence in Looker Studio. You will also learn how to use breakdown dimensions and optional metrics. For this example, we'll add a new page. We'll call this page Optional Dimensions. Done. First, let's see how time intelligence works. First, let's add a date range control. Done. Next, let's add a time series chart. To use time intelligence in Looker Studio, there's something very important we need to understand. To explain this concept, I'll use a table chart, so let's add one to the report. We'll leave it here. We'll select a period. In this case, let's choose last month. Perfect. Let's sort by date in ascending order. Perfect. What do these data need to make use of time intelligence? When we talk about time intelligence, a date must be defined in the correct format. I've left a reading on the correct date formats in the class resources. If we go here, we'll see that the defined format is in the date and time data type. It's important to keep this in mind. If you want to manipulate the data, if you want filters, especially period filters, to work, and for all charts related to dates to display correctly, they must be in an appropriate date format. Once this is set, you can apply different uses of time intelligence, such as, let's see here. What would happen if I want to see this chart by year? First, I'll select the period this year in the date range control. And I don't want this chart to show by day. Currently, it's displayed by day. I want to change it to another format. When working with a dataset or data source, you'll often find that this dimension appears broken down. For example, here we have it broken down by year, year, and month, day and day of the week. If I select here, I can see information for each of the different months of the year. This is how we start manipulating our charts, as long as there's a date dimension included. But what happens when we don't have this dimension included? Let's reselect the dimension as date. When we don't have such a detailed dimension, but it's in the correct date format, Looker Studio allows us to drill down without having to add any other dimension. How do we do this? We enable the drill down option here, and you'll see different date formats appear. Let's remove the year and date, leaving only year month. Now we can see the date by the different months. That's why it's so important for our database or dataset to always be in an appropriate date format. Now, let's learn more about breakdown dimensions. In this case, we'll leave our original dimension, which was date. We'll set last month in the date range control. Let's see something important. Suppose I want to view the date, or rather, have the chart configured with the date and the views metric, just as it is now, but I want it to break down by another dimension. To do this breakdown, make sure to enable Drill Down, and in the Breakdown dimension, add the other dimension you want to break down the chart by. In this case, we'll use the Gender dimension. This way, in our time series chart, we can see the breakdown, not only as a total views metric, but with another dimension. Let's try with another dimension. Age. As you can see, the chart adapts to the age ranges, and now, instead of showing gender, we see our age ranges over time on a chart. You can apply this to multiple charts. I encourage you to try it and experiment. Let's move on to another feature in Looker Studio, optional metrics. We'll set this page to be taller. Let's make it double, in this case 1800 pixels in height. Let's add a series of charts, and I'll add a pie chart. I'll also add a scorecard. For now, I'm not too concerned with which metrics and dimensions are displayed. We'll also add a bar chart with the device category dimension. And a geographic map chart. Done. Each of the charts is set with a particular metric. What happens if I want to see another metric on the same charts without adding a new one? Looker Studio has thought of this as well and offers a practical solution. In a single chart, we can integrate multiple metrics. Let's see how it's done. I select the chart, and in the settings I go to Optional Metrics, where I can add more metrics. I'll add views, sessions, and new users. Perfect. What happens when we add this? When we enter view mode, it will allow us to choose any of the metrics we set up beforehand. Now I want to display another metric. Since I've already added optional metrics, I select the optional metrics option and can choose the metric I need. I'll switch to new users, and we can see how the variations appear. This is a very useful feature that we'll use almost always in our reports. It allows us to save space and make presentations more fluid, avoiding crowding multiple charts in a single report. I encourage you to try this with other charts, applying this configuration to see how it works.